Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I want to start by saying, don't be afraid, church. I have a lot to say today, but don't be afraid. If you miss something, or if I speak too quickly, don't worry. The recording of my message will be available online later. If that's not your style, I am very excited to share paper copies of my message with you. If you miss something, don't be afraid. We'll catch it. I also want to say, don't be afraid today to let your mind wander. I may repeat myself a bit, and you may find thoughts come and go with my words. The title of my message is We Are All Grieving, which is, I think, a scary topic. It makes sense to be afraid. It is a normal, natural reaction to get scared at the word grief. Dare we call it an involuntary response to get scared to hear about grief. Now, I suspect none of us here need to be told that this is true, that we are all grieving. I suspect many of you already know that this is true or have something in mind that you are grieving. I also want to be clear that when I say grieving, I don't mean the immediate feeling of hurt or sadness or pain or anger that comes as the result of a crisis or tragedy. I do mean this and much more, because this immediate hurt is acute grief. There is so much more to grief. What I mean now by grieving is the whole mess of sadness and anger, all of the involuntary physical responses we have to loss. Let me rephrase this to offer us a working definition of grief for today. Grief is an involuntary physical response to the experience of loss. Can't choose not to grieve. This is important for us to understand for many reasons, and the biggest reason I think today Reverend Jude shared in our reading. What is at stake for us in learning to grieve well is hope. I think too often we understand hope as some nice feeling that we feel in response to good news or good fortune or a stroke of luck. I've heard hope simplified to mean the feeling of having your material needs met alongside having attainable long-term goals. I think this is absolutely a true experience I have had of hope. However, I think hope is more. It is also a decision. It is also a practice. Hope is something that must be shown. It must be done. Hope must be lived. Hope looks like getting up in the morning, every morning. Hope looks like taking care of yourself when you know someone else isn't going to do it. Hope looks like listening carefully, trusting another person's words. Hope looks like being willing to hurt and being willing to share another's hurt. Because hope says that suffering is temporary. Pain ends. All suffering ends. Joy comes in the morning. Today is a joyful day, not just because it is Easter season in my tradition. church. I say today is a joyful day, and I am saying it so that it might be true. Today is a joyful day, and we are also all grieving. Yes, it can be both. I would argue it must be both. This is a bit of ancient African wisdom, that grief can be joyful. I suspect that you all here in this room do not need to be taught this either. Perhaps you already knew that joy was coming when you read the word grief at the top of your order of service. Perhaps you felt a little bit of fear and then expected joy when you clicked on the link if you're joining from online. Perhaps it is neither of these situations for you. Perhaps your own experience of grief is present, even now, so present that you don't need to be convinced that it is true others around you are grieving as well. Perhaps first you thought of something you lost or someone. It can be scary to hear the word grief at all if you are still grieving. Perhaps this person came to mind, and perhaps in the course of our conversation today, other people or things will come to mind that you may be grieving and not know. Grief, again, remember, is an involuntary physical response to the experience of loss. I will say, church, for me, grief shows up in my body most often as a tightness in my throat. It looks like shortness of breath. Grief is a physical experience. Now, loss is a human experience. Change is constant in our world, and along with change, so too is loss. I would hypothesize, those among us who have lived the longest, who have experienced the most, have the most to say and share, have the most to teach about loss. The universal experience of losing something, even if it's just your keys, losing something is a universal experience. If you have ever lost something, it connects you to everyone else who has ever lost something or someone. Now, I'm not saying, church, when we are all grieving, that we are all sad or that we are all mad. What I'm saying is that losing something ignites an involuntary physical response, often without our choice, sometimes even without our knowledge. I mentioned that what I know of grieving comes in large respect to me from the African tradition. You know, I've heard it said more than once, it is interesting I should lean so heavily on my Catholic roots, especially here in worship, and less on my experience of worship in African American traditions. To me, this is not really a very interesting distinction. It's not even one I make myself. Christianity, likewise Catholicism, and with it Roman Catholicism, are not European in origin. I'll say that again. Not even Roman Catholicism is European in origin. Fascism, however, is. And in what we call, it is true that what we now call Catholicism most often looks like an Italian or Spanish form of fascism, especially in our Holy Roman Catholic Church. But what I want to say is that while fascism is alive and well in our religions, so too is diversity. We cannot forget that diversity lives and thrives, breathes within our tradition and in the traditions around us that we would like to say are hegemonic. We forget that diversity leads to infighting. And in our tradition, as in other traditions, there is plenty of that. We are living in a time of spiritual reckoning, and I hear it and I feel it even on the edges of this congregation. We are very much present to a time of spiritual awakening. It can be exciting, and it can also be terrifying. Some of you may have seen, but it seems our world is crumbling around us. All of our institutions are crumbling. It's as if we can see through their cracks. And it seems our religions struggle the most to withstand this change. Some of that looks like a mistaken identity. Church, I want to remind you the reason we gather together in this way is to help us cope with change, help us cope with loss, and help us cope with grief. What I know in my body, what I know from my teachers, is that this powerful existential grief that comes from loss, it threatens hope. It threatens our ability to withstand anguish and despair. I would imagine some of you do not need me to tell you that anguish or despair feel threatened by grief. I'm up here today, and I hope to speak very clearly. Even though we are still getting to know each other, I think you are still getting to know me. I am still getting to know you. But one thing I do know, we are all, what? You can say it. Grieving. Thank you. One of the bits of wisdom that I bring also from the African tradition of worship, I can't do this up here all by myself. I need to hear what's going on for you too. I need you to join me. Can you hear it? Yep. Can I get an amen? All right. I need your attention. I need your participation. And I need you to be willing to communicate it back to me. The reason I need your help in particular, church, is that we, the elders, and I do mean elders, I believe all of us here, even you, Gracie, all of us here are elders. We, as elders, have a responsibility to teach grieving. We have to do it, and we have to teach it. The reason, and I've said it already twice, is because what is at stake for us is hope. I know it's a scary thing to talk about grief, especially from the pulpit. I know that grieving is a hard thing to look directly at. It takes courage, confidence, and most importantly, it takes collaboration. One thing I've meant to discuss, I've noticed for much of our time together, these seats here in the front and on the sides are most often empty in our church. Now, these are the seats that are most primed for receiving spiritual insight, and these are the seats that are most specifically designed to receive spiritual wisdom. I wonder why these seats remain empty. I suspect some of it has to do with the coronavirus, because that has changed much of the ways that we gather. But I also wonder if this choice of seating doesn't reflect a desire for safety, so that you all may not be implicated by the pulpit sitting too close. That's all right. Grief is scary, and I would be scared too. I wonder if anybody would be willing to change seats. No pressure, no pressure. I bring this up in particular because grief is a normal and natural response. Our opportunity here as a church is to lean into it. We can sit up front for it. Don't be afraid to grieve, especially not with these fine people. Even though grief comes in the form of difficult and terrifying stages like fear or anger or sadness, even denial and acceptance, don't be afraid to grieve. Not here, not with us. Grieving is an involuntary physical response, remember. We can't choose to ignore it. An involuntary physical response to loss. If you know about grief, if you know you're feeling it, if you recognize it when it shows up, it can equip you to manage it again in the future. This is what we are doing here, church. This is why we gather. I bring up these experiences, in particular, my experience in the African tradition, because this is the specific, necessary, and vital function that the church must perform for every community, that of communal, shared grieving. This wisdom has allowed an endurance of unprecedented suffering here in this country. But it has done the same in others. Last week was Easter Sunday. Reverend Peggy did such a powerful job retelling the Easter story for this community. I understand we don't share that story very much, but I know the story of Easter very well. It is the story of a young man, a young black man named Jesus, who was driven by spiritual conviction through his experience of betrayal by his friends and family, and subsequently execution by a cold and heartless state. I remind us now that this symbol of state virtue, because we are talking about it by a different name today, fascism. It is the same symbol of state virtue today, the destruction of the bodies of black folks. This symbol is one that we receive from Reverend Dr. James Cone, who reminds us that the cross in America looked like a lynching tree. I bring up this time of suffering because we should also remember that the Easter story commemorates an older Jewish tradition, Passover. We are grateful to have a senior minister that can preside both over Easter services and over a Passover Seder. What a blessing that is, and unfortunately I missed it. Judaism brings many of these tools into play and contains a great deal of wisdom concerning how to help a community deal with grief. We would do well to remember this geographic location of all of these Abrahamic traditions, Judaism included, was African in origin. Much of the ways of life that were allowed to continue unchanged in the wake of European fascism are those influences that they themselves, these traditions, inherited from their African ancestors. And I've said this before when I'm playing my banjo. I brought it, but I'm not going to get it out for you today. This instrument is a bit of African technology designed for this purpose. It is designed to help communities grieve. It is designed to help communicate the voice of the ancestors so that we might grieve together. I understand that it might be hard for our Western imagination to understand just how important a practice of shared communal grieving might be. But right now, church, trust me, these are the most important muscles for us to strengthen together now. The reason, I've said it already, is because grief, and by grief, remember, I mean involuntary, physical response to loss. This grief causes suffering and anguish. What is at stake for us in anguish and suffering is hope. I've had Moses on my mind a lot lately. I'm not sure if you remember, Moses' life began, at least the story in the Bible, in a basket floating down the Nile. Moses was adopted by the Queen of Egypt and raised as a prince. The reason this child was floated down the river in a basket, of course, is fairly sinister. I considered reading this passage of the Exodus story to you, but I considered it again. It's perhaps too scary for me to read. Suffice it to say, Moses was not the only baby floating down the Nile River. I thought about reading this passage, but I encourage you instead to read it yourself, because it's important for us to remember Moses' mother's innovation, putting bitumen and pitch on the basket to make it float, was a necessary innovation in response to Egyptian law. Babies were floated down the river. Likely none had as much success in their endeavor as Moses. I am thinking about the song we just sang. How good and how pleasant it is to gather together. Hine ma tov, uma naim shevet achim gam yachad. I imagine Jewish artists, Hebrew artists, playing melodies much like this on instruments much like that, thousands of years ago for many communities, learning to grieve together. I've had on my mind the reopening of BJ and Helene's shelter as well. It feels to us like a bit of a decision to welcome some baskets into our church. Those of us who have been on the front lines of this work can say it is too easy to recognize so many baskets go uncared for. In the face of our world's suffering, what is at stake, friends, is hope. Hope is more important. It is important now more than ever because we need strong defenses against hopelessness and against despair. Remember, grief causes anguish and suffering. Suffering is, on the one hand, both simple enough that we can understand it, but on the other hand, it is a complex theological problem Reverend Peggy will deal with in a later sermon. That's enough on suffering for now. But anguish is something else entirely. The poet Renata Suzuki reminds us that anguish is just one of those words you understand the meaning of just by the way it sounds. Anguish has a gnarling rasp to it. You twist your mouth around to say it, kind of like the feeling it gives to your insides. Grief at any stage can cause anguish. Now, I don't know if you noticed it from the reading that Brene Brown offered, but she says anguish is an almost unbearable and traumatic swirl of shock, incredulity, yes, grief, and powerlessness. These things fold into each other. This is my point, church. This mess of anguish and suffering and grief is a recipe for hopelessness and despair if we do not grieve together. This hopelessness that we might feel in the face of our world's evil, in the face of so much suffering, this is a normal and natural response to the difficult trauma that we are witnessing. Our world, as I said, falls apart right before our eyes. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, then I don't have much to say to you. We need good, strong tools to survive through the midst of this loss. Why? Because what is at stake for us is our hope. The whole reason that it is so important to me to be up here, to preach to you, to care for you. It's the reason it's so important to me to play this instrument and to practice the process of communal grieving. The whole reason is because I believe the only thing that will see us through these times is our sense of hope. It is what I have identified as the most important thing that I myself need. It is the most important thing I have identified that my children are going to need. It's the most important thing I think you might need as well. Hope. We cannot get hope from our community if our community doesn't know how to teach it. We learn our sense of hope from our ancestors, from those around us and teachers who have walked the road before us and who have experienced more loss than we have. If our elders are not cushioned to the experience of grief, if our elders are not skilled in teaching and transmitting grief, then, friends, we cannot serve the necessary function our society needs to shepherd them through this difficult time. I say all of this, and I get so impassioned to say that my children, who are 4 and 6 and 12, I bring them here because I want them to learn to grieve communally with us and with you. I want them not to be torn apart by the grief and anguish and suffering that they have already experienced and will certainly experience in a world that's falling apart beneath them. My children's generation will experience the 6th mass extinction of all of world history. These systematic destruction of our systems as well as nature itself. A natural, normal response is hopelessness. A perfectly reasonable response is despair. Church, we do this work and gather in community and sing and tell who we are every week, specifically as a testament to the enduring power of hope. We rise every day. We get up in the morning. We brush our teeth. We wash our face. We say, "What's next?" Because today we choose hope. Hope is not just a feeling, remember. It's not just a response to a stroke of good luck. Hope is the practice. It is the willingness of acknowledging pain and suffering and recognizing that it too will end because joy comes in the morning. Church, I started by saying, don't be afraid. I don't say this to soften the sting of anyone's pangs of loss. Not at all. I do not say this to minimize the uniqueness of each one of our lives and the suffering we all must endure ourselves. I do not intend to reduce anyone's particular grief. I do not intend to shrink anyone to the lowest common emotional denominator. No, I say that we are all grieving to remind us that in our lives and in our suffering, we don't get to choose to be alone. We're not alone whether we like it or not, because all of us here are, what? Grieving. We're all grieving. All of us are grieving. I can stand here now and say this, that we are all grieving, only because I have been electrified by hope. Can you feel it? Can you feel the hopefulness in this space? I can, and that is why I have chosen it, because this hope, this electric hope, is not despite the pain that I've experienced. It's not despite the hurt. It is that I know that contained within our efforts to grieve together, there is a magical, mystical power to heal not just myself, but you too. I have been ignited by a recognition that grief and suffering, even anguish, are all perfectly normal, perfectly natural, healthy responses to the sort of loss we all must endure. I will say that our suffering, our anguish, is sanctified. It is made holy. It is not holy so that it can be justified. I'm not here trying to justify our suffering, but rather that we are justified in our humanity, and we grieve together. We process this grief together in order to create a hope that we couldn't rationalize our way into. The power of hope to disassemble despair. The power of hope to annihilate this anguish. The power of hope to systematically subdue our suffering. That is something that has to be experienced, and I couldn't explain it to you from here. If we are not the ones to provide hope to future generations, who will do it? We are the elders. We are the ones upon whom the responsibility rests. We are here to teach hope, not just in theory, but in daily practice. It is our responsibility to teach resilience through hopefulness. It's our responsibility to teach grieving for hope's sake. This reflexive rejection of despair and hopelessness can be learned. It is not natural, but it is life-saving technology. Now, I am blessed to come to you today with these strong convictions and belief in the cloud of witnesses because it is part of my tradition that those ancestors continue to help guide us through this difficult practice and these difficult processes. We still are our world's last line of defense against hopelessness. And I want to say, taking a step back, if you still are feeling that hopelessness now, if you are feeling despair and anguish, it might be unresolved grief, and it might be okay, because suffering doesn't last forever. The trouble won't last always. It is not on you all by yourself to get out of grief, to get out of hopelessness, to get out of anguish all by yourself. We, this church, are here to help. I promise that joy does come in the morning, and you don't have to take my word for it, because today, here together, this church is doing the work of learning how to grieve together. Together, this church is learning how to become a warm blanket of joy, of happiness, of intention, of truth, of awareness, so that this world can't keep you or me or any of us down. Don't be afraid, friends. If you're sad or angry, don't be afraid. If you're overcome with grief and hopelessness at the tragedy and evils of our world, you're a normal person. Congratulations. Anguish is a perfectly reasonable response to this kind of suffering. Hopelessness is an entirely reasonable response to this kind of suffering. Perhaps this is why I mistrust reason sometimes, because common sense and reason sometimes are subject to the flaws of our observation. If we see pain, if we see only anguish and suffering, then we cannot see hope. Beauty, joy, mercy, kindness, these testify to the enduring reality and the urgency today of hope. It is only through grieving together that we can trust this hope. It is only through grieving together that we can learn to practice this hope in efficient and reliable ways. Joy is a discipline. This is not an invention of a monastic community. It was an invention of gathered communities. Friends, this is what I am here for. I am here to say that the preservation of hope in the face of despair is what church is here for.